Chair Schiff, committee members. I'm going to start quickly by giving you just a brief history of the site. I know we haven't, as a commission or as a committee, you haven't seen this. The Preservation Commission spent a great deal of time dealing with several applications. Then before you is a historic variance to reduce the number of parking spaces from 290 to 204 parking spaces for the Pillsbury A-Mill complex redevelopment. This is official name is A-Mill Artist Loss. Its address contains several addresses, but 301 Main Street, 413 Main Street, 300 2nd Street Southeast, 400 2nd Street Southeast, and 103rd Avenue Southeast. At the HBC meeting on March 20th, the HBC unanimously recommended approval of the historic variance and bringing it forward to you today. Just to give you a brief synopsis of the site so you have a background, I believe this packet's also been passed out to you as well. The A-Mill site actually consists of 10 contributing resources to the historic district. The Pillsbury A-Mill, which is on the front corner here, I think most people are familiar with, is a National Historic Landmark, one of 3 in the city, one of 2,600 in the country. It's combined around a growth of million in industry. It's in the Santee Falls Historic District. Santee Falls Historic District is designated for transportation and industry, are the 2 main aspects of the district that are important and significant to the city of Minneapolis and the nation. The A-Mill the complex consists of a warehouse 1, a south mill, a cleaning house, the red tile elevator, which is pretty well known, the white grain elevators, which front 2nd Street, a building called the machine shop, and there's 2 non-contributing resources that are buildings, which one's the Manildra processing building, which isn't labeled, but right here where the cursor is, and then the former warehouse 3 research annex, located at the corner of 5th Avenue Southeast, the former right-of-way there, and Main Street. The site also contains 2 contributing structures. These are the Great Northern Rail Corridor. This is the rail corridor that goes between the back of the buildings and also along Main Street, and also the hydropower water resources. These are the water power canals that go under Main Street that fed the mill itself. They still exist. Kind of a magnificent piece of history, and hopefully someday they can be reused. Here's another photograph just showing that you can see the rail corridor in this space right here. And you can see just another view here. You see the Phoenix lofts in the foreground, the white grading elevators. One of the important pieces about this property, and one of the things that may have been lost when it came back in 2006 for the previous development, was the importance of the connections of all these resources and how this area worked. The rail corridor in the back is a very important aspect to understanding how the whole historic district operated and how this complex operated. Every machine, or every building, every resource operated as a machine to work and to produce grain and to move grain in and out of the, move flour out of the space and grain into the space. I have some old maps just kind of showing how that complex grew. You can see the rail corridor. Here, this is 3rd Avenue Southeast. The rail corridor came through and terminated there. Main Street is on the lower part of the area. Pillsbury A-Mill at this point was just really the A-Mill and a couple additional buildings that are no longer extant. By 1912, pardon me that this is a little blurry, but the red tile elevator had been constructed, the rail corridor is still there. We're starting to see the buildings kind of build around this complex and really start to become more of a system and a cog as Pillsbury itself became a more successful company. By 1919, it's shaped that we kind of know it as today. The historic resources were all constructed. This is a planometric drawing. These are all from the Minnesota Historical Society's archives. Here you can see the red tile elevator here, warehouse 1, which fronts Main Street, the A-Mill. You can see that the linearity of the rail corridor. You can actually see a shed over the rail corridor at the time behind the red tile elevator. That actually protected an area where the rail cars actually dropped their grain and went through the ground and then back up into the buildings. Here's a map of that. It's quite busy, but the point showing it's just this complex has grown, and it's grown into a kind of this industrial machine that we see now. This is an interesting photograph. It's from 1955. It's a Fairchild photograph flown. And you can see the A-Mill, the red tile elevator here. You can see the rail corridor coming through. You can see this is 6th Avenue Southeast. 5th Avenue Southeast is here. This is just a photograph from 1919 at the back of the Pillsbury A-Mill. You'll notice that there was a transfer table at the back. When I showed you on the maps 3rd Avenue Southeast was the terminus for the rail line. To move the cars in and out, they had to have a way to take the cars down, slide them over, and move them back. We see this in other areas as a roundhouse. Since they didn't have the land for a roundhouse, this was just a sliding table. And here's another photograph of the rail corridor. In 1927, showing Warehouse 2 here, the white grain elevators here, the red tile elevator. Here's a picture from 6th Avenue Southeast from last fall, demonstrating just a little bit different of the context, no longer the same hustle and bustle that was going on when the A-mill was in full operation. A picture from the spring, from the back of the A-mill, looking downriver.
I think that's good context, Mr. Schaefer. The item we're here to discuss is the parking variance for the new development. So can you give us an overview of the new development and the staff recommendation on the parking variance?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So the redevelopment, the Pillsbury A-mill complex is being brought forward by really 2 developers working on the entire complex. The project that you have before you is from Dominion. They have a purchase agreement for all the historic buildings on the site. The non-contributing buildings and the other open development parcel had a purchase agreement and were purchased and closed by Doran companies. So this area here is the Dominion portion. This, which you see in the hatch mark, is a future proposal for Doran's Phase 2 project that hasn't come through the city yet for approvals. The applicant is proposing to convert the entire A-mill or the historic properties into 252 units of affordable artist housing. They're using all the buildings except for the machine shop. The machine shop is proposed to be sold off for commercial tenant space. Applicant can speak more about that if you'd like. The proposal includes the subject for the parking variance is the inclusion of parking to reduce the parking for the entire site. The applicant came forward originally with surface parking in the rail corridor fully. They didn't have a structured parking system, which really created a problem because the rail corridor itself is a historic resource. And if you fill that historic resource with cars, you no longer can understand the functionality of that space. It looks like a parking lot versus a rail corridor. So the applicant worked with staff and worked with the neighborhood organization and other stakeholders to develop a plan that met their needs, met their market needs, and staff felt met the policies and ordinances are adopted by the city. As a result, they're providing 152 structured parking spaces. What you see in the photograph or the image on your right is an area outlined in orange. That image shows the extent of the underground parking structure. There'll be a next picture to show you a better detail of that. It's also included in your packets. That parking structure contains 152 spaces. It's below ground or tucked into the hill, so it doesn't expand into any of the historic areas. It has 31 spaces of parking in the railroad corridor. Again, staff and the neighborhood had concerns about putting parking in the rail corridor, and the applicant kept reducing the number of spaces. The Heritage Preservation Commission and staff felt that this was a good compromise to reduce the amount of parking and still really interpret the rail corridor and have it act as an historical interpretation and preserve the integrity of that resource. There's 21 spaces in between the machine shop and the white grain elevators, which is here. Those 21 spaces are dedicated to the machine shop as a commercial, when that commercial tenant comes in.
So those 21 are not for residential use?
At this time, they're not dedicated to residential use. The parking variance encompasses the entire complex at this time, so they are included in the parking variance. We assume the use of the machine shop. It's 27,000 square feet. We assume that it was a general retail and sales with a parking requirement of, I think it became 35 parking spaces.
Why are they included in the parking variance?
Why are they included in the parking variance? Because it's all operating as one complex. We figured it would be the best to include that at one time.
Okay, so we're kind of pre-approving without knowing who the commercial tenant is going to be, a variance for that building as well. Okay.
So this is just a diagram of the parking structure. The L shape is what's below ground. These 2 levels are also below ground. These are below the machine, in that parking lot space in the machine shop, between the machine shop and the white grain elevators. This is the machine shop service lot. I'm pointing out just a historic map. and I don't want to give you too much more on the character, but one of the big pieces about their project was to make sure that we could retain the volume of space within the historic rail corridor. By encroaching on that space, acts as a destruction or destroys part of the character of that. So as their proposal came forward, they showed this parking area kind of bumping out farther than what the back of the machine shop or the white grain elevators did. Historically, there was a building called the Brand House. You see this orange arrow points to the back of that Brand House, and another building that actually operated in that space as well. So the proposal does not encroach on the rail corridor. This is just a facade of the rail corridor of the parking structure. This is what you'd be seeing if you're in the rail corridor from 2nd Street Southeast, which is you would not be able to see any of the structure. This is what would be seen if you're within the rail corridor. So there are 2 required findings for historic variances. The first is that the variance is compatible with the preservation of a property and with other properties in the area. The proposed variance to do any other additional parking, staff felt would require either the demolition of a historic resource, whether it's the contributing resource of the rail corridor or the destruction of a building. So we felt that the proposal was compatible within those regards. It preserved the historical function of the space. It preserved the visibility of the space and really preserved the character.
And just to clarify the numbers, Mr. Schaefer, the 21 surface parking spaces are for the future rehabilitation of the commercial space. So we have 152 spaces plus enclosed, plus 31 surface spaces for the 250 unit development.
Yes, we have
a variance of 67.
Yes, in total, if you include the machine shop as part of that, which staff did, the total parking requirements 290, and in the variances end up providing 204 spaces.
But just for the residential portion?
For the residential portion, there's 252 spaces required, and they're providing 184. I think is that 250, 152 plus.
I got
33.
152 plus 31.
Yeah.
So 183 spaces provided for 250 units?
Yes.
Okay. Question from Councilmember Goodman.
I'm interested in this required finding number 2. I mean, actually, it's not a unique situation to a historic building to not have parking. What's unique is that they bought this parcel without buying the rest of the parcels in the area, thus allowing the bank to bifurcate the developable parcels for parking. So that's something that actually was created by the applicant, not created by the applicant. So I'm not sure how you see it any other way. There was a whole big piece of property for sale. One group cherry-picked to make it possible for development. The other did not. That is something that was caused by the applicant. How do you meet this finding? There are plenty of historic buildings in town that don't have parking where parking is available. I live in one of them, the Bellevue. No parking, no on-street parking, meters just like all the rest of downtown. And Laurel Village, the Bellevue was required to go get parking when it was sold by Benson McKay in 1982 and get 25 or 35 parking spaces as a requirement for the residents in the Bellevue and the Kenosha. Why didn't you suggest that they have to go do that?
Chair Schiff, Councilmember Goodman. The applicant, to answer the first question, the applicant can speak to how they came into the.
I don't know if the applicant will be speaking. This isn't a public hearing. We'll probably get to that point next.
Okay. I will allow the applicant and we'll allow people present to testify today. So.
But the bottom line is we have to determine whether or not that required finding has been met. And it seems to me they can get up and say we didn't meet it, we couldn't buy it, we couldn't afford it, we fought with Dorn, whatever the excuse is. They knew when they bought it, it didn't have any parking. So they either have to build it, find it, or otherwise provide it. We shouldn't be creating a situation where it's more difficult for everyone visiting that area and the people that live in that area to have parking. So that's something we determine they don't. Don't we write the findings?
Chair Schiff, Councilmember Goodman, yes, we do write the findings. And in this case, staff felt the historical resources, the spaces that were allowed, what was on the site, what the applicant had control over at the time that they presented the proposal, not the spaces that were outside of their control. Space that they had under control and the volume of space under control. They did not have any other opportunities to provide parking on the site that would not result without destroying portions of the integrity of the historic district or the integrity of one or two of the resources in the district. So staff evaluated it in the realm of what was under control by one property owner and not what was previously proposed by or previously under control by the bank at the time. So that is where staff found that there was hardship in the fact that there was no other volume of space. The only way that they could actually provide parking was to either go below the ground or look outside for other spaces. The applicant can speak to who they look to. The travel demand management plan identifies ample parking in surface lots and in in parking structures nearby, and they understand the rates for that. I think the economics of a long-term lease and the durability of that is an issue that presented a challenge for the applicant. CPED itself actually encouraged the applicant to work with the other property owner or other applicant that was coming forward with the other half of the BNC property, Doran. The applicant had spoken about the difficulties in trying to make that work from a financial perspective and other aspects. CPED spent well over a year working with both these applicants, trying to get them together on a coordinated site plan to address a lot of the current concerns. What you have before you is the results of a very long deliberation and work with them to get to where we thought we can make the site work and also make it rehabilitatable.
How far are we from seeing the Doran proposal?
Doran Phase 1 has been approved by the Preservation Commission and the City Planning Commission. I think they're working on getting their building permits now.
Okay.
Their Phase 2 site.
What's their parking ratio?
I do not know their parking ratio to tell you the fact that they do not require a parking variance for their structures. New parking or new structures, any time I think should be able to provide their own parking. I think our code authorizes that. Our zoning code identifies the troubles in providing parking for historic buildings, as Councilmember Goodman pointed out. And in everything but residential structures, it offers a 25% reduction for those spaces. For residential structures, there is no reduction. If there was a reduction, the parking variance would be negligible or non-existent, depending on how the applicant can configure that parking. But due to the way that our parking requirements are set up, they would not be able to meet those our requirements today.
Okay. Question from Councilmember Gordon.
I have two questions. One of them has to do with kind of if there's a precedent for this, or it seems like this is depending on how you do the math, a significant number of parking spaces, so it's a significantly large variance. It's not just one or two. And have we done this in other instances at the same level for historical variance?
Chair Schiff, Councilmember Gordon, yes, this is a sizable reduction. It's a 30% reduction in parking. We have done this through historic variance last July. We did a historic variance to vary all the parking for the soap factory, 68 spaces, so that was a 100% reduction. That came forward through the Zoning Planning Committee, I think on July 14th, 2011. So there is some precedent for making those reductions in the past. One of the points I'd like to point out as well is with residential units, I don't have the numbers to talk about that within Santa Fe Falls Historic District. When you're in the downtown districts, we don't have a parking requirement these days. And so we've had a lot of rehabilitation of residential structures in downtown, historical structures, and we haven't had those parking requirements. And so I can't speak to what those reductions would be, but I don't know if they met them one-to-one.
We recently participated in the rehabilitation of Cedar Riverside Towers, and it was designated historic. Does that have a one-to-one parking ratio for units?
Chair Schiff, Councilmember Gordon, I don't believe it does.
I
don't know the exact number of that, and that's not a locally designated property at this time, but they did go through the National Register nomination and receive that honor.
Right.
I have one more.
Yeah, Councilmember Gordon.
Could we approve this conditionally on them getting an agreement with the new development for additional parking? Is that an option?
Chair Schiff, Councilmember Gordon, I think everything is an option. I think feasibility is probably a question that is a concern, and also recordability. How are we going to keep those that are durable? We do shared parking agreements when there's actually people that have a shared facility. If you're looking to go find and execute a lease in an existing structure somewhere else, we don't have the ability to record that necessarily. Some of the durability of those questions, I may defer to the city attorney to provide a little bit more guidance on that. And so I don't know if you want to hear from him now, or we can direct that question to him later, or you can hear from the applicant if you want the applicant speak about how they can structure that.
Okay.
It might be nice to hear from the attorney one time or another whenever it makes sense.
We'll definitely do so.
And ultimately, one of the last pieces for that staff finding under B, the hardship, was that we felt that any reuse of the structure would require a parking variance in the way it's configured today. If it was a commercial reuse, it was an office reuse, the parking requirement would be well over 500 parking spaces. That's after the 25% reduction. And in that regard, we didn't see that there was any other opportunity that we would see without a lower parking rate. So we felt that this was in keeping with what we'd have to see for any type of reuse of the site, given the circumstances we are in.
And on the site plan, can you show us again where the new parking is being constructed?
Yes. The site plan, the orange boundary is basically the outside boundary of that. It runs along, the surface lot is attached, or I think the cursor up, surface lot is accessed from 2nd Street. 3rd Avenue Southeast here is where you'd access for the pedestrian or the residential underground parking. It goes into this building, into that space, and accesses, there's one floor of parking above that entrance, one at that level, and then one level below the site. It wraps around the machine shop, or around the white grain elevators, as you see, into an L configuration, and terminates basically at the end of the white grain elevators. One of the issues that the applicant identified in their process is that they need to handle stormwater on site, and doing so, they don't have this. They have to do on-site retention for that, and the structure wouldn't really prohibits that from going any farther towards 5th Avenue Southeast.
And what happens with the rail lines that are there today?
Chair Schiff, the rail lines will be removed. There's a condition of that they have a sensitive removal, and they work through a process with both the city HPC staff, the State Historic Preservation Office, and National Park Service on a formula to remove those the rails sensitively. A lot of them are embedded in concrete. The ones that can be sensitively removed, they will be replaced back in the site and reinterpreted. And ones that cannot be salvaged during that removal will be replaced through another interpretive material or through interpretive new rails. They have a few different ideas how they're interpreting the rails between vegetation in between the rails, some paver types. They also have a water feature in there. So some significant amount of interpretation of the rail configuration as it exists today, not as it existed in 1930 or 1912, but as it exists today.
Okay, question from Councilmember Reich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is it an underground or surface water retention system?
Chair Schiff, Councilmember Reich, it's an underground system, I believe, with filtration and overflow above. There is a green space. In this site here, you see a cluster of trees and other grasses, and the applicant can speak more to how that system works. But it does exist at both a below-ground system and above-ground filtration system.
And how many layers are they going underground for the parking?
The proposal right now is one level of underground parking.
Okay. I know there's significant water table issues here, so is that preventing them from going to 2 levels of parking underground?
Chair Schiff, the parking structure below ground, the applicant stated that they've run into issues with trying to make sure they maintain the integrity of the existing historic structures. And I haven't understood the water table fully. I know there's some water table issues, especially connecting the larger stormwater management that comes through the site and all the way down to the river. But there's also bedrock fairly close to that. So they're trying to manage all those pieces. The applicant can maybe speak more to what their what some of their more geotechnical analysis showed.
Okay. Anything else in your staff report?
At this point, no. If there's questions, I'd answer more of those.
A question from Councilmember Hofstad, who's joined us today.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for allowing me to speak in your committee. As a member, I'm not a member of the planning committee, but I do have a couple of questions. Mr. Schaefer, you'd mentioned that that additional information has not been provided, I think, as I understand you, regarding underground parking. So it's our assessment that one level of parking underground is the maximum that can be provided for this site, or is there potential for exploration of additional parking?
Chair Schiff, Councilmember Hofstad. The applicant came to us and said this is what they can do to provide that parking. We did not see a geotechnical study to see if they could provide more. I think the applicant can probably speak if they have some ability to rearrange some of their parking and see if they actually have what their actual depths are and what they can go. We did not ask to see that geotechnical study. We went through a long process to get to where we did. I felt we had a good win from a preservation and a planning standpoint.
Thank you. And I have one more question, Mr. Chair, if I may. Regarding parking in the surrounding area, what exploration was done about adjacent parking?
The travel demand management, or Councilmember Hofstad, the travel demand management plan that's included in the packets identifies several parking spaces, lots of opportunities, both bicycle parking and transit opportunities, both on University Avenue, 4th, and Central Avenue. So they identified those issues. They identified from a parking standpoint, they identified 2 commercial lots. The commercial lot, which is across on University, between University and 2nd, across from St. Anthony, Maine, and the commercial parking structure formerly owned by the city. Both those have several parking spaces. They identified the rates of those parkings and how many available spaces there are, and those would satisfy the needs of the missing spaces in what the applicant cannot provide. From a zoning code perspective, a variance would be required no matter what, because of the way our zoning code is written. You can't do a shared or an off-site parking for those spaces and have that satisfy for for a parking agreement or your parking requirements. The applicant also refers to the fact they spoke with General Mills, the most proximate, that owns a parking lot the most closest in proximity to the site, and also found that they were unwilling to negotiate for any other parking. And I think the applicant can speak more to those details in those conversations. But the results of their conversations was reported back to staff as that they were not able to find any additional leased parking across the street in a shared facility with General Mills.
Another question from Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you. Well, if the applicant couldn't negotiate it, how would individual low-income artist residents be able to negotiate it? I mean, the developer now has their feet to the fire, has to do it. They can't do it. So if they can't do it, the residents can, so then that means it's not an option.
Chair Schiff, Councilmember Goodman, the option would exist in the existing pay lots to have a lease. I could go there today if I wanted to and apply to have a parking pass for a month or annually. And there's rates identified in the travel demand management plan. The General Mills lot, which is their commercially owned lot, you're right, a resident would not probably be able to negotiate that parking agreement if the developer couldn't either.
So if we don't do something to say they have to do it, it won't happen.
Chair
And
Schiff,
where will all these people park?
Chair Schiff, Councilmember Goodman, that's a fair assessment. If they can't provide it, obviously the residents won't be able to find it either.
Okay, and just to clarify, 250 units or 252? 252
units, and I believe the staff report was 252 units. I think that's what it is. I think there might be now up to 255 units. Is that 255 or 252? 252.
Okay. One final question from Councilmember Goodman.
And how many of them are 1 bedrooms, and how many of them are 2 bedrooms, and how many of them are studios? Because the total unit count isn't really a good reflection of how many people would actually be living there.
Councilmember Goodman, that's a good question. I don't have the exact unit or number account, but actually it's in the university area overlay. So when we calculate the parking requirement, university area overlay requires that you have either the maximum of half parking stall per bedroom or 1 parking stall per unit. The whole project has 322 bedroom units. So I don't know what the breakdown is between 1, 2, and 3 unit studio spaces, but in total it would have 320 bedrooms.
So this property is within the university overlay.
Yes.
And so that puts a tougher requirement for parking on them.
In this situation, in most situations, yes. In this situation, the greater requirement is the number of units, which is 252, which is our standard parking requirement as well.
So they're under which set of rules?
They're under the university area overlay, but they're meeting what would be the standard parking requirement that we'd have for residential structures.
Okay. All right. This is not slated for a public hearing, but because of interest, and I know that, can I just see a show of hands, how many people are here for this item? Okay. So we'll open up some public testimony and first allow the applicant to make a presentation to the committee, and then we'll open up a public hearing.
Morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair, committee members. My name is Owen Metz. I'm with Dominion Development and Acquisition, the developer on the project. We're very pleased with the approvals we've received so far from HBC and thank Brian and staff for working through a very complex project. We worked really hard with our architects over the past several days, given some of the recent, concerns, and are committed to providing another 56 stalls underground for a total of 260. The variance approved at HBC, as you know, is for 204, and we have been able to get to this 260 number and are committed to doing so. So we end up with a modest shortage of about 30 stalls, or roughly 10% reduction in stalls. We believe this is a very reasonable request given the physical and historic constraints of the site. David Motzenbecker with BKV can speak more directly on those constraints. We're very excited we were able to come this far. You know, it's taken a long time to get to where we are, and the recent success we've had in determining some of the bedrock locations and exact soil borings, which David, again, can get into the details on. But we're very happy we've been able to address some of the concerns of the broader neighborhood and reduce this number to an amount that we think is very modest and reasonable. And again, thank everybody who helped us get to that point. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to David Motzenbecker and allow him to help address the physical and historic constraints.
Okay, and I just have to raise my concern, Mr. Motzenbecker. I serve with you on the Planning Commission. This item is coming before the Planning Commission. I thought we had clarified rules about Planning Commission members testifying before the Zoning and Planning Committee.
Yes, Chair Schiff. Thank you. I wouldn't be here except there was no one else available from my office today to testify to this, to assist Mr. Metz, so I'm here on this behalf. If you do not wish it, I shall not testify. That's fine.
I think it complicates things to have a member of the Planning Commission testify to this body, since this item is going to be heard by the Planning Commission and then possibly appealed to this body. I think it complicates the public record.
Understood. I can let Mr. Metz clarify some of these items.
Okay. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Can I use his notes?
Yes, absolutely.
I guess the biggest issues physically and historically, and this is all, I think, backed up by our work with the Mercy Homes Neighborhood Association and trying to address some of the historic concerns of the railroad tracks, and then some of the pedestrian-friendly and very publicly accessible site that our neighborhood, the Mercy Homes Neighborhood, has requested. The main issues physically with the site, obviously we have a plethora of historic buildings and the foundations associated with them. There's a physical limitation of the bedrock below ground. In working with BKV recently and their engineers, we've determined the exact location of the bedrock. So we've been able to effectively sandwich in another layer of parking and be more sensitive to some of the building foundations within the existing footprint. So that's how we've been able to achieve additional stalls.
Okay, so the current size of the variance that you're requesting now?
The current size would be a 30-stall variance from the 290 required, and we understand this is new information. So, Mr. Chair, I respectfully defer to you on how to potentially handle this procedurally should it be approved and move forward.
Okay, so you still have 252 housing units, and how many parking stalls for just the residential units?
We have 260 total. Subtract the 21, so we would have 239 for the 252 units.
239 dedicated for residential use for the 252. So I'm saying that's
I'm
now,
doing the math right.
you're now requesting a variance of 13 parking spaces?
For the residential, yes.
For the residential.
I apologize. We need to give 10 more spots. I forgot. 10 more in-ground spots to the commercial use. We're negotiating with Schaefer Richardson on that commercial building. So in addition to the 21, they would like 10 of the internal stalls that we're going to share between commercial and residential. So splitting some hours. So it's a little bit goofy math, but it would be 229 then, worst case, for the 252 apartments.
Okay, so you're asking now for a parking variance of 26 spaces with flexibility for 10 spaces to be shared between commercial and residential. Right. Okay. Questions, Councilmember Goodman?
Well, I appreciate your admission that you're using goofy math. Can you tell me, compared to what we see here, 152 structured parking spaces, how many do you have? 152, more or less?
More.
How many? Compared to what we all see on the screen, 152 structured parking spaces, how many do you have?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Goodman, we have 209 underground parking stalls.
Okay, and how many
plus
surface?
21 surface stalls at the machine shop.
Got it.
Plus 30 parking stalls in the rail corridor itself.
So do our staff have that in writing somewhere? Is that something that we've seen? Is that something you're getting up and telling us now?
This is something we're committing to today. We've just figured this out that we can do this, so that's why I'm here today asking for for help and guidance on how to address this.
Okay.
So you're asking for a smaller variance today than what was approved at the Heritage Preservation Commission?
Mr. Chair, Councilor Goodman, yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So as I calculate that, and Mr. Schaefer, I don't know if this is news to you, but it's still a variance of 26 with approvals for shared spaces between residential and commercial. Is that the math you get?
To confirm the math, 260 spaces being provided totally, 209 underground, 21 in the surface lot between the machine shop and the white grain elevators, 31 in the rail corridor, 10 spaces below ground being dedicated towards the commercial use would result in my calculation, a 23 space reduction for the residential uses.
Okay.
So 252 minus 23, my math is fuzzy on the face of it, but I think it's 229 spaces.
But a variance of 23
Yes.
for the residential uses. Okay. It's hard to guess what the parking need is going to be for the commercial space because you don't have a tenant yet. So probably the most intensive use there would be a restaurant, which could result in a need for another variance down the road, or if it's a gift card shop, then you're going to have an excess number of spaces. Okay. Committee members, are you clear on the changes? Mildly clear, says Councilmember Gordon. All right. Clarifying question, Councilmember Tuthill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is, will the rents for this building include their off-street parking stalls, or are they going to be additional?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Tuttle, the underground parking, in order to make it financially feasible to introduce, we do need to charge rents above and beyond the rent that the resident would pay in the apartment.
So it's included with the rent?
It is not. It is above and beyond.
Above and beyond, okay.
I'm just going to throw it out there. You've heard it from me before. If there's any way to really look at that math and include it, which would mean additional rent, I get all of that. But we are finding in high-density areas like my ward that when it's additional, people are parking on the street, and it creates a problem for the rest of the community. So if there's any way you can figure out a way to either roll in part of it or all of it into the rents, I think it would be beneficial not just for your tenants, but also for the surrounding community. Thank you.
Councilmember Gordon.
I think it would help if I could get clarity on the number of surface spaces in the railroad corridor. It says 31, but then you said 30, and then staff said 31 again. So
what was submitted, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Gordon, what was submitted to Brian and staff as part of the variance had 31 in the surface. I believe with the redesign of the parking structure, we had to lose a surface stall in the rail corridor, given that now we're at 30 today.
So 204 structured parking spaces, 30 surface spaces in the railroad corridor, and 21 surface spaces adjacent to the machine shop.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Gordon, it would be 209 structured spots, plus the 21 at the machine shop and the 30 in the rail corridor.
Okay, and staff said 31, so is it 30 or 31 there?
30.
Mr.
I just
Schaefer.
asked that. He said they had to take one away so they could expand the structured parking.
Okay.
So he's sticking with 30.
Just want to make sure Mr. Schaefer is on the same page.
Chair Schiff, appreciate that. We have not seen the site plan or any information to show what we actually calculate, but from repeating what the applicant's spoken, 30 spaces, they've lost one in that space, so staff understands there's 30 spaces in the railroad corridor, and staff looks forward to seeing the plans to understand that further. That would probably have to come back for the commission for amended CFA as well.
Great.
So.
And I have a question for you, Mr. Schaefer. In the travel to management plan, has there been any study by transportation engineers of housing projects where rent is not inclusive of off-street parking, and how many people take advantage of that, and how many stalls just sit there empty because people are unwilling to pay extra?
Chair Schiff, council members, I can take a look at for you, but from recollection, I don't believe that's identified in there. They talk about where parking is available, the transit routes that are available, the bicycle routes that are available. They talk about the street intersections, the count of traffic, but I don't believe they count that study difference between having the parking tied into the rent or not. So.
Yeah. I don't know how to include this in future TDMs, but I think it would be really useful information to have, as Councilmember Tuthill pointed out. We could approve a variance here, and you could still see a couple dozen extra empty stalls just sitting there not used because people don't want to pay extra because they don't own a car, because, not everybody owns a car in the city of Minneapolis, particularly downtown. So it'd be interesting to have an average based on a study of other buildings that we've approved that are multifamily that have the requirement of additional paid parking.
Mm-hmm. Chair Schiff and council members, I believe we can work with Public Works, who also reviews that plan with us in the future to work on those. I think I can let the plan
really good to know what the averages are. Councilmember Goodman?
I think that's a good question. I'll just note that there are 322 bedrooms. So already you're assuming 100 people aren't going to have cars. So I think it's already a big leap to suggest that all the other people aren't going to have cars too. The bigger issue is under the way that this is being financed, you have a rent cap. So basically you can't charge more than a certain amount of rent on most of the units, as my understanding, since you're calling it affordable. So how are people who qualify for this reduced rent as a result of the financing of the project going to then turn around and qualify for a $100 parking spot?
Mr. Chair, Ms. Goodman, it's our opinion as owners and developers apartments that even in low-income apartment communities like this, that residents, if they choose to park inside, are able to find $50 or $80 a month to afford parking rent.
Even if their income is such that they qualify for a subsidized apartment?
Correct.
Any other questions for the development team or anyone else on your team that wishes to present?
I don't think so.
And just because staff hasn't seen the site plan that confirms the numbers, did you create more compact stalls, or how did you just redo the engineering on where the support beams are? How did you find the extra spaces?
Mr. Chair, that was by determining the exact location of the bedrock and being able to actually fit an additional level under the rail corridor.
Additional level. Okay. Considerable cost. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you, guys.
Okay. We have about half a dozen people signed up, but I saw more than half a dozen hands raised for speaking on this item. So what I'm going to do is allow 15 minutes of testimony on for both sides, people in favor of the parking variance and people opposed to the parking variance, just because I want to keep it equal, and I don't know based on the sign-in sheet if everyone's signed in or what side you want to testify. So I'm just going to ask that people opposed to the parking variance state their name and address for the record and come up to the microphone and speak. And if you agree with the previous speaker, there's no need to repeat that information. You could just introduce your name and address for the record and say you agree with the previous speaker.
Thank you, Chairman Schiff, members of the committee. My name is Tim Keene, Keane, 220 South 6th Street, Minneapolis. And I am here on behalf of the Phoenix on the River Homeowners Association, speaking in opposition to the variance and any reduction in the parking requirement for this project. The residents of the Homeowners Association are requesting an opportunity for a full, fair, and complete hearing on the decision to allow departure from the parking requirements. There is no need for this variance to come before this committee at this time. The application for the full approvals for the conditional use permit and the mixed use project is in process. That will be coming before the Planning Commission and this committee, again, when you will have an opportunity to review the design, when you have had an opportunity to customarily consider variances and departure from other code requirements. This is a bit of it's a very substantial anomaly from the process that we're all accustomed to, where variances are included in the full regime of the project, where people have an opportunity to review the project, to look at its impacts on the neighborhood, to look at its impact on the site development. We don't have that. We don't have a site plan. The city staff has acknowledged that they don't have a site plan. We're cobbling together a variance on the back of an envelope for a project we haven't even seen. The Phoenix residents did participate before the HPC, and if you look at the record of the HPC consideration and their action, you have no idea what the parking variance was, what the magnitude of the departure was. This is a black box. People do not know what they're getting. This project has over $100 million in public assistance coming to it, and they're not providing adequate parking to comply with the code requirements. Market rate projects around here that have complied with the parking requirements and do adequately tend to their own parking necessities are now going to be burdened with this project that is not going to maintain their on-site requirements and are going to have to burden the street and contribute to the congestion of an already popular and highly used area. I will leave time for the residents of the Phoenix to speak, but I suggest that this committee can simply deny this request at this time and let any variance requests come forward as part of the full regime of land use applications that we'll be following.
Okay.
Thank you.
And just on that point, this application is correctly before us at this time. Mr. Nilsson, can you explain the Heritage Preservation Commission's powers and how we get to this application today while we'll be reviewing the rest of the project later?
Sure, Mr. Chair. I think there was a decision made in light of the fact that this has unique status as one of 3 national historic landmarks in the city, and the unique preservation considerations that are involved in a historic variance, which aren't necessarily involved in a traditional land use parking variance. That's why this was the chosen path today. It does include, as well as the findings have been noted, it does include the traditional variance factors, but there is this other consideration with regard to preservation of the historic structure.
Okay. Okay. Anybody who'd like to speak, please come. I'm sorry, this is not a courtroom. I'm sorry, Mr. Keene. Not a courtroom. Okay. Not a courtroom where you get to debate back and forth. It's a public hearing format, so everybody gets to speak once and allow other people to dispute their interpretation of the city attorney as they speak. Anybody else to speak on this item?
Yes, my name is Hugh Norstead. I live at 222 2nd Street Southeast, Phoenix on the River Building. And Chairman and council people, I'd really like to thank you for your service and what you're doing, and I really appreciate the insight you've given us to some of these concerns that we have, especially Councilmember Goodman, Councilmember Tuthill, in terms of residents at the proposed A mill being able to afford parking underground. I personally feel that that's going to be a difficulty for them given their income requirements. And then the surface parking lots and surface parking ramps, it's the same story. Whether it's $1.50 a day or $45 a month, $3 a day, $90 a month, they aren't going to be able to afford that. They aren't going to be plugging meters on the street for their parking. So it's going to push the parking out into the residence area of Marcy Homes neighborhood. I don't think the Marcy Homes Neighborhood Association has really seen that or has come up on their radar, but it's going to be a difficulty, I think, for the residents in those communities where there's free parking on the street. It's going to displace the parking areas for those residents and their guests.
And since you live in the area, can I just ask a question? How many streets are not metered currently within walking distance of the Phoenix?
On 2nd Street by the white grain elevators, those aren't metered. They're full every day. Mm-hmm. There's no parking along Main Street along the side of the A mill running from 3rd Avenue down to 6th Avenue, so there's no parking allowed there. And now they've changed the metering now, and so the meters are being monitored from, I think it's 8 a.m. till midnight. Right. The majority of the area, some areas it's 8 a.m. to 6 p.m.
Pretty much everything within walking distance is either metered or not allowed.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good morning. My name is Warren Kelly. I live at 222 2nd Street Southeast. I'm a lifelong Minnesota resident. I want to be very brief. I'll start out with what Mr. Metz had to say. He said, quote, the architects have worked the last several days, quote, to figure out the additional parking. This is a great historic property on the Mississippi River, one of the last great undeveloped properties, as you understand. to come up with sort of a back of the envelope solution once again to get an end around, to get the property approved, seems incredulous to me. I feel bad for the council because you're being asked to approve a variance for an incomplete project for a developer that doesn't even own the land. It doesn't make sense to me. I'd also like to go back to a comment made by Council Member Gordon. He respectfully acknowledged that what are the precedents going on. I think if there's a precedent that's changed in here with the parking variance requested by the developer, it's going to be a precedent for all other developers going forward, whether they're using public money or not. I think it sets a very dangerous precedent. I remember one last thing. I think that as a homeowner, I think that a lot of things have been changed. We have not really been informed. I have great concerns about the lack of parking going forward and the incomplete nature of the plans being presented by the developer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jason Hall. I live at 222 2nd Street Southeast. I want to bring up the fact that they talk about this parking lot and this parking structure that are nearby. The parking structure is being reused and being sold to become a multi-housing unit, is what I understand. So that shouldn't be considered. The parking lot from Central to 2nd on 3rd Avenue, or 3rd Street. Also, I live in that neighborhood. I cross 2nd Street and 3rd Avenue every day, and it's a very dangerous intersection. To add 260 cars coming out of that corner, because 2nd Street is an alternative trucking route for the business further down the road, it's just extremely dangerous already, and I just feel that it needs to be looked at better.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, my name is Sue DiNuccio, and I also live at 222 South Main Street. I'm a new resident. The only thing that I would call to your attention is I read through the traffic study, which was conducted on a Thursday in November. It was 20 degrees. They didn't include Main Street traffic at all. The study included 2nd Street, Central, 5th Street, but it doesn't have any turning ratios on Main Street. And that's in Mr. Spack, who is an engineer. And so I sent a note to someone in the city asking them what the requirements are as far as having a representative sample. So it's a Thursday, it's not a weekend. It's November, it doesn't include any warm weather numbers. It doesn't include Main Street. And in the diagram above, I literally am in the, I look over the AML. So from my windows, I counted cars on Easter Sunday morning at 8 a.m., which not a lot of people walking around on Easter Sunday morning. I also counted cars on St. Patrick's Day, Sunday after St. Patrick's Day. Not a lot of people walking around and driving on the morning after St. Patrick's Day. My numbers in an hour were double their counts. I'm not an engineer, but I just did my own sample because I'm at that vantage point. It's also, because of the riverbank, it's an incline, a very steep incline. And so cars are going quite rapidly up that area. And I mean, I'm a layman, but I think there's a life safety issue. There's pedestrians, there's bicyclists, there are baby strollers, there's dogs. And nowhere in the traffic study is there anything about the Main Street intersection, which presently is a stop sign. So I don't know. I don't think you can rely on the submission as being meeting guidelines from public safety standpoints. I also want to say I'm in favor of, I want to save the building, but I want to do so so that neighbors, visitors, and residents are all properly served.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Carol Mack. I also live at Phoenix on the River, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this issue. One thing that hasn't really been referenced is the vitality of the business district on Main Street. There are many restaurants, there are a couple of retail businesses in the Phoenix itself, and parking is a huge issue for these businesses. We don't want to turn into, God forbid, I don't want to offend anybody, but Uptown, where often, we'll talk about going to Uptown for dinner and there's no place to park, so we change our minds and we go someplace else. And I think that these businesses, they deal with a lot in terms of road races and walks and public events, and to put this burden on the businesses in the neighborhood, which is a huge part of the vitality of the neighborhood, I think is very unfair. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Shelley Stoner, and I live at 222 2nd Street Southeast. And Carol took part of my answer. So I'm simply going to say I hope you did see, and it does underscore her comment. There was a letter from Look and See, which is one of our lovely retailers in our building, that was sent to all of you about how this she felt was going to impact her business. And of course, more importantly, I went and spoke with the businesses on the street right along there, and they knew nothing about this parking variance, which I found disturbing. I'm going to take a larger view and just paint a picture. I don't know how many of you have ever put together one of those 1,000-piece Ravensburger puzzles where you look and you see a million different things. They're a great way to spend the summer. And we happen to have a beautiful vantage point where we can see the helicopters coming down to Hennepin County and the clop, clop, clop of the horse and buggy going to the Nicollet Island Inn, and the cars going over the Hennepin Avenue Bridge, and we can hear the trains in the background, and we are living the city. I feel like the parking is personal, but the parking also affects both sides of the river. One of the great pleasures we have is to look out our window, and on most Saturdays, many people come and park on our side of the river and have a cup of coffee, walk their dog, and have their baskets, and they walk over the Stone Arch Bridge to go to the farmer's market. We're connected. Parking affects the other side, and the livability and the rhythm of the way we live and the way other people come and experience where we live. And on Sundays, there's another great Minnesota experience, is to see people come and park in our neighborhood, have a hamburger and a beer, and to see a sea of purple jerseys walking over the Stone Arch Bridge, and 4 hours later to see them all coming back. I hate to lose that rhythm. It belongs to everybody, and it's about the livability of our neighborhood. And I think losing that kind of parking and not having a master site plan and a larger parking plan for the way we want to live on the central riverfront is a missed opportunity and is a mistake, and we'd like to see the leadership of the city help us figure it out so it continues to work for everyone. Thank you.
Okay. And we're just looking for new information at this point. Again, if somebody's already spoken about lack of parking in the area, if somebody's agrees with comments of previous speakers, there's no need to repeat that for us. You can just simply say you agree with previous speakers. Good morning.
Thank you, Chair Schiff and members of the commission. My name is Mike Cook. I also live at Phoenix on the River. I'm kind of a numbers guy, so I was confused with what was being presented, and I just want to make sure we understand what the variance is based on some very new information. My count is 209 underground spots, 30 surface spots in the rail corridor, and 21 next to the machine shop. That totals 260, right?
Correct.
Okay. Now, they have committed 10 of the underground spots to the commercial space and 21 in that ramp next to the machine shop for commercial space. That brings us down to 229 parking spots for the 252 residents, correct?
Yes, that's the math I have.
Now, My understanding is the minimum requirement is 290 for the 252 units.
I believe the minimum is 252.
It's 252.
A 1-to-1 ratio.
Got it. Okay. So the information I had was 290, and I wanted to make sure that the variance being requested is not 61 units, but in fact then it's the 23 that you have.
Correct.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Peter Bachman. I live in the Phoenix building as well. I'm here with my wife today, and we're opposed to the parking variance. We've loved the neighborhood. We love the riverfront. We love the Marcy Homes neighborhood. And if you're there on a summer evening, you'll find that the rest of the city loves that neighborhood too. It's a very busy place in the summer, and parking is tough to find now. When this project goes in, it's going to make that problem worse, even if it meets all of the parking requirements. So we'd ask that the city please, in this very heavily publicly subsidized project, not grant any parking variance and create a real livability problem for the neighborhood. Thank you.
Chair Schiff and council members, thank you. My name is Rob Stanek. I live at the Phoenix on the River as well, 222 2nd Street Southeast, Unit 501. Councilmember Goodman, thank you. You're the first person I've heard through this whole process that represents the city or works for the city to ask some of the questions that you've asked today. So I thank you. It made me feel good. Finally, someone's listening to us. I just want to state that I know Marcy Homes Neighborhood Association has written a letter of support, but I want to make sure everybody understands Marcy Homes Neighborhood Association does not speak for the majority of the neighbors living within the vicinity, and I'm talking within blocks of the A-Mill project. As we've gotten the word out, a small group of residents in the neighborhood, and as we've spread the word, we haven't run into too many people that don't agree with us. And we're focusing our efforts along the riverfront. Nicollet Island East Bank Neighborhood Association, I know, is opposed to the variance. They've written a letter to that effect and have a resolution to that effect. The other side of the river, we've spoken to a lot of folks over in the Mill City, Mill Ruins area. For the most part, we are running into folks that agree with us. A lot of folks don't even understand the process. And part of that problem is I didn't even understand it until a few days ago. I had no idea the historic parking variance was taking place of the regular variance until the Phoenix hired a lawyer to help us understand it. I didn't know that. And with that, thank you. And I agree with all the opposition's comments to date. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've taken about 15 minutes of testimony in opposition to the variance. I'm going to open the public hearing now to those in favor. If there's anyone present to speak in favor of the variance.
Hi, good morning. I'm Melissa Bean. I'm Executive Director of the Marcy Homes Neighborhood Association. I'm also a resident of the neighborhood at 516 6th Avenue Southeast. In case you don't know it, the Marcy Homes neighborhood was voted by Metro Magazine as the 4th best neighborhood in the city, so we're very proud of that. And part of that factoring was the walkability, the closeness, the transit that's available in our neighborhood, and that would certainly hold true for this project. Also, Nice Ride Minnesota bikes are very close by. It is the association approved this and supports this variance. And I would like to say that we do have a member of the Phoenix on our board, also in agreement with the Neighborhood Association on this. It's our opinion that any project that to reuse the historic A-Mill is going to need a parking variance. So we want to save this historic structure. We want to bring more people down to our beautiful river to enjoy our great neighborhood. We were very happy to welcome the Phoenix, and we'll be very pleased to welcome this artist community. I think it's a city goal. Our neighborhood is in the area where more density is planned, and people are just going to have to get used to that, but density has its good sides. Density, the more dense our neighborhood is, the more amenities that will come our way, the more stores, entertainment, etc. It'll just keep improving our neighborhood and bring more people and businesses to it. Businesses on Main Street are likely to gain a lot of customers from this as well. So I guess, in closing, it is there has been a process through the neighborhood. We've worked very long with the developers, architects, and we're very pleased with the progress. And knowing that even more parking spaces now are going to be available is great. This is a city neighborhood. It's dense. We already have parking from University, from Marcy School, from Aveda Institute. That's just the way it is in a city neighborhood. Oh, and by the way, I would hope that some of the residents that do move into this project might send their kids to Marcy. So for us, it's a lot of potential, and we very much look forward to it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else to speak in favor?
Councilmember Schiff, council members, my name is Ben Haywood. I'm the executive director of the Soap Factory non-profit art gallery, which has been in this neighborhood since 1995. I've been living and working in the neighborhood for 17 years or so. I'd just like to make 2 points. One, it seems to me that this is a perfect example of why you have something called an historic parking variance. It allows the development and refurbishment and preservation of historic buildings without substantially altering their historic landscape. That's why you have a parking variance, why you have something like a parking variance. It means you don't have to demolish bits of a building in order to provide parking for that building to function. So that's one point, and I think in some ways it's kind of unusual that this discussion is being had. As I said, this is why you have a parking variance. The second point I wanted to make is really based on my experience running the Soap Factory Gallery. Obviously, we're one of the largest contemporary art spaces in the Twin Cities. We work a lot with especially young people and artists. If this project is geared towards low-income artists and creative people, I can tell you 100% that a large proportion of those people will not be owning cars. They'll be committed to transit. They'll be committed to nice ride. They'll be committed to their own bicycle use. And they will be finding ways not to use cars. And then finally, just to echo Melissa's point, this is about density. We're not talking the suburbs here. We're talking the center of Minneapolis. We're talking where this city started. Either this building gets developed with some compromise, and it appears to me to be very minor, compromise on parking, or it doesn't get developed. I've watched this building decay over 10 years from the soap factory. If it is not developed soon and quickly, it will continue to decay. And at some point, the city will be confronted with having to look at demolishing it. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? And can I just clarify, what was the size of the variance given to the soap factory?
0.
From how many spaces would have been required? If you can come up to the microphone.
I beg your pardon, sorry. 68. Okay. To 0. Thank you very much.
Okay. Anyone else to speak? Anyone else? Mr. Keene, I'll give you 2 minutes for rebuttal if you'd like. Or if there's any questions for...
Thank you, Chair. It won't take near that long. But the point raised by staff at the conclusion of the Q&A to them, which findings are we going to comply with? The historic preservation variance findings, or the more rigorous findings found in the customary land use variance section of the city code? So,
the prior.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Seeing no one else, I will close the public hearing. And I have questions for the applicant. And I dropped my pen here. Excuse me. You have dedicated spaces for future commercial use. while this committee has shown a willingness to vary commercial uses down to 0, you've also dedicated underground parking spaces for that commercial use, correct?
Chair Schiff, excuse me. Yes, that's correct.
So one thing we could do is dedicate all the spaces that you've got associated for the commercial use to the residential use. And given the precedents from this committee and the Heritage Preservation Commission, they seem more than willing to vary down to 0 parking requirements for commercial uses. How many underground spaces were you going to dedicate to the commercial use in the ramp?
Chair Schiff, we were going to dedicate the 21 surface plus 10 underground is our agreement with the potential buyer right now.
So I would recommend that those 10 underground be dedicated to residential, which would put your variance request from 23 down to 13. And then how many surface parking spaces do you have?
Chair Schiff, we have a total of 51 surface stalls, 21 of them being adjacent to the machine shop.
So again, of those 21 adjacent to the machine shop, you've got enough to dedicate those to the residential and have one-to-one parking stall. You'll just need to come back in the future for a variance. But what I keep hearing from the committee and from our past actions, we're more than willing to vary commercial historic buildings down to 0, but people are very concerned about residential maintaining a 1-to-1 ratio. So that could be one way to solve this issue. They have enough parking on site to do a 1-to-1 ratio for all the residential and not need a variance. They'll just, if we follow what we did for the soap factory, just come back in the future and grant a larger variance for the commercial use. What are your thoughts on that?
Chair Schiff, committee members, it will make us selling the machine shop significantly more difficult, but we've overcome more difficult challenges so far, so I think we could probably live with that.
Okay. Well, that'll be my recommendation is that the 10 underground stalls, that the additional stalls that were identified by the developer today, and the 10 that they had suggested be set aside for commercial use be instead all dedicated to residential use, and the remainder of the spaces needed for residential units that are provided on that commercial lot be dedicated for residential use. So that lot basically will be split, half commercial, half residential, and the entire underground would be dedicated to residential, resulting in a parking variance of 0.
Chair Schiff, could I ask that it be allowed that a shared parking agreement between the commercial use and the residential could be sufficient to handle daytime, nighttime?
I think we would get to that when the commercial parking variance comes before us. That's when we would deal with a shared arrangement.
Okay.
So that's why I suggest the committee members' discussion. Councilmember Goodman.
Well, maybe I could live with that. I think that's kind of a good solution. I would prefer to see the remainder of the commercial spots dedicated to guest parking, because my other concern is that you have people who are living in this building. I've never seen a downtown project where there isn't some guest parking, even if it's 7 spaces or 8 spaces. I also don't object to the shared parking either. I think that's a good idea. If they can have the commercial during the day and the residential in the evening, it might be less expensive. So maybe some people will actually buy it because they'd only be able to park there overnight. They could share it with the commercial during the day. I think that's a better solution for the practical reality. I don't think people are going to buy parking spots here if they're living in an affordable apartment at that high price. But that would be something for them to work on. Building an additional level of underground parking is very costly. I think it's a major give on their part. I do.
Absolutely.
I think we should recognize that.
Absolutely.
It's probably $35,000 a spot. They have to generate some revenue in order to pay for it. They probably will have to reduce the cost in order to get some revenue back. So I think it's a possible solution as long as the guest parking issue is resolved within the surface lot, and we encourage that shared parking. That would be, 260 spaces total, all dedicated to residential, and the remainder from what they needed to guest parking, with a shared parking agreement.
And Councilmember, I'm thinking of Stone Arch Apartments down the street. I don't think Stone Arch Apartments down the street has any free guest parking. Every time I go to visit my friends who live there, I have to pay a meter.
It's a hassle, I know. Just like at my house.
But it's exactly every time I come to your house, which isn't often enough. I have to pay on the street. So I don't see a difference here really in why this building in a historic district should be required to provide free visitor parking, since so many others in the immediate vicinity. Phoenix has how many free parking spaces for visitors? 13. Okay. Never been invited for dinner. I'm just saying. Councilmember Tuthill.
As long as we're on my favorite subject of entertaining, I'll tell you why I agree with Councilmember Goodman, how important I think off-street parking available for guests. If you have had any friends in the medical profession and somebody has a visiting nurse or a visiting physical therapist after they have fallen off their bike, and those people cannot park, it's really tough. And I know that from friends of ours that have had those jobs, and it's very difficult for them to get to see clients. So if there is any way to even reserve 1 or 2 spots for guest parking, particularly during the day, during business hours when more and more people are getting physical therapy and visiting nurses in their homes, I think is really practical and makes a lot of sense. Because even young adults fall off bikes and fall on skis. It's not just folks who are senior citizens.
Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to impress on you the importance I think these guest parking spaces will provide. I also wanted to just note, I do think this process is really confusing with regard to the historic variance, the fact that there isn't a public hearing as a result of it, that the public has a hard time understanding that this went to the HPC. They didn't know that, instead the Planning Commission, even though there's the same notice. I really want to thank you as the chair for allowing public testimony. I think that is a big thing in terms of making the public believe that we care about what they say. And I also want to thank the applicant, didn't fight it, didn't stand up and say don't let them speak. I think people do that, and I think it's important not to do that. I think you handled it really well, and it certainly aggrieved a wrong I think that the neighbors thought was going to happen by the virtue of them not being able to speak. And that's why I think you saw so many emails coming into us, because there was a concern that they wouldn't be heard. And I hope that in the future we can have, maybe Councilmember Hofstede's office can have better communication with leadership in the condominiums. That's what happens on my side of the river. We talk to the condominium associations about when things are coming up that affect them, and hopefully this will activate a lot of people to follow what's going on all projects on the river. But I appreciate the opportunity for people to speak.
Absolutely. And Mr. Schaefer, because of what we've discussed today needs to be written down in a document and approved, I wouldn't dare try to make this audience sit through us wordsmithing language that memorializes this concept. So may I pass that to you to write up for the full council meeting a week from Friday?
Chair Schiff, council members, I can work with the planning director and our city attorney to develop that, I believe. If I can get a nod of okay from over there.
And how many days will that take you? You think you can have that done by Monday?
Chair Schiff, council members, we can try to get that done by Monday, yes.
Okay.
Can you get that then? And the applicant.
To all of us, yeah.
Chair Schiff, council members will get it distributed.
Okay, so what I'll do for now is make a motion to deny the variance and to adopt the findings as drafted by staff, and those will be available for public review Monday, and we'll take that up at the full council meeting a week from Friday. Mr. Nilsson.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I might just say, since we've kind of designed on the fly a bit here, that yes, staff to draft new findings in addition to the document that you asked Brian to draft. We will also do the findings to reflect the current variance standard, which is practical difficulties. There's an outdated reference in the code here. We're all aware that it's practical difficulties. It's applied the same way as undue hardship was prior to Krummenacher, and the updated findings will simply reflect that.
Okay. All right. So do we need to take a formal vote at this time how should we proceed?
It sounds like the options would be to deny. Well, there is no appeal. It's here before you automatically.
Oh, okay.
And so your motion is in order, I believe, at this point.
Deny the appeal and adopt the findings as drafted by staff.
There is no appeal. So it would be to grant the variance in part, deny it in part. I think reflective of the motion you've made in addition to staff direction to draft findings in accordance with that decision.
Okay, Ms. Hanson, our clerk, did you get that? Excellent. Final word, Councilmember Hofstad.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for hearing the public at this hearing. I think it's an important part to the whole process, confusing as it has been, not because I haven't communicated with the various entities and neighborhoods and condo association. The process has been very complex, as we talked about from the very beginning, and the direction that this council was going to be going, the direction of having this on consent rather than discussion. So it's really critical what happened today, and being able to have conversation and input of all of the members who are affected by this decision, and to have a strategy which allows compromise and addressing of the parking and the vitality of this particular community. It's not much different than the discussions that we've had in other parts of the city about maintaining our vitality while being able to address a variety of needs. So thank you for your input and for all the members who came down here. And I know that staff has been very engaged in as well as my office, in communicating with the variety of people who've been interested in the complex nature and certainly the number of hearings that we've had regarding this particular issue.
Thank you. And I will just comment briefly on the process. I was a little surprised when this came up on our agenda as without a public hearing scheduled. And that's when I learned that variances from the Heritage Preservation Commission technically can't be appealed, and that they're just passed on to the council as a recommendation. So I've asked staff to fix that public process gap and to draft a new ordinance that would clearly state the right for an appeal for variances granted by the parking variances granted by the Heritage Preservation Commission. I think this is the only application we have in the city that can't be technically appealed. And I think we should correct that. So I've asked staff to draft that language immediately for the council to adopt this year. And I will note, just because I think we've identified also changes for our transit demand plans in the future. I'm really interested to know how many of the condo and apartment buildings out there that charge for parking are sitting there with vacant parking stalls. And I think that's going to inform us and help us make better public policy in the future. So I'd like to see a survey of existing properties, both historic and non-historic new construction, just so we know what happens when parking is included with rent versus charged extra. And although we are humbly the 58th largest city in the United States, 48th largest city in the United States, we rank 35th for cities without where people live without cars. Approximately 20% of Minneapolis residents don't own a car. So we don't know what the impact will be until the building is full, but it is possible. I do think that in artist housing like this, that not everybody will own a car. And so with nothing else, Councilmember President Johnson.
Mr. Chair, I would just point out that this is something we have to look at, because I will tell you that 20% of the people are not the people that are going into some of the housing that's getting built. Those 20% still, the people that are going to move into this apartment building will have cars. So I think we fool ourselves if we think that they're not going to.
And yeah, and we don't need to fool ourselves. We can simply do surveys of existing buildings and find out who owns a car and who doesn't. So I'll look forward to working with my colleagues on that in the next year. On the motion before us, as recorded by the clerk, all in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? That carries. Thank you, everybody who took time to come down today and provide input.